So this is where we get a lot of resistance from our students. They come to this writing class. A lot of them, are there like, oh yeah, I always had A's in English. I'm going to be so
Hmm.
good at this class. But they got A's for writing 5-paragraph essays, which is like a national structure of writing essays in the United States. It's an introduction, 3 supporting paragraphs, and 1 conclusion. And it is boring as fuck. Like, it does not produce interesting writing. It's often like pro or con essays and
Yeah.
so on. They are brilliant at that. Then they come to English 101 and it's like, and then they have this teacher like standing in front of them telling them, I actually don't care about your grammar as long as I can understand. Like, I don't care if you like have typos in your writing. I don't care if you use the subjunctive or some like shit. Sorry, I should stop swearing. But it really doesn't matter because your ideas are not tied to grammar, and like focusing on this notion of standard grammar and this like one and only style to use is actually very exclusionary to different types of Englishes and squashes ideas.
Welcome to the Unconditional Teaching podcast. Unconditional Teaching is a project by
Katharina Pietsch,
Jessica Koch,
and me, Tilzi Wuhre. We publish essays and papers, record podcasts and conversations, and we give workshops and talks in which we dissect power structures in higher education and present concepts and practices that make our seminars more relationship-rich, more mindful, and more collaborative. For today's episode, we have a special guest. We welcome Sophia Brauner, who was a former student of ours at Bielefeld University, and she's now an English graduate student and teaching assistant at Western Washington University, Bellingham in the United States. Hi, Sophia. It's so great to have you with us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Would you like to say a couple more things about yourself? What are you doing right now? How did you get there? Maybe what are your academic topics and interests?
Yeah, sure, I'd love to. So, as you already said, I did my undergraduate degree at Bielefeld University in English and Educational Studies. And I finished my degree, well, during the pandemic in 2021. And after that, I started my master's degree here in the United States, in Washington State, at a university that I had already been to for one term during my undergrad for a study abroad program. And I really liked the English department there and the beautiful nature of Washington State. So I returned back here for my master's degree in English. And I am, finishing it up right now. I have 6 months left. I'm working on my master's thesis right now, still taking classes. And my academic interests are rhetorical theory. So I've been doing a lot of work with rhetoric and composition.
Mm-hmm.
I am writing my thesis about this concept of rhetorical vulnerability, which doesn't really yet exist in the field. So I'm trying to conceptualize it myself and see what it does, how it works. And other than that, I'm teaching composition classes or writing classes to basically finance my studies, but it's become a very integral part of my degree and my learning experience, teaching writing and learning more about how writing works with my students. So I've taught a lot of writing classes during my degree. English 101 is what they're called. And right now I'm teaching English 201, which is a more specified writing course. But I'm sure we'll talk about this during this conversation. So
Yeah.
I think I'll stop here.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. I would like to talk about the writing classes. I mean, this is what engendered basically what started our interest in talking to you on the podcast when we sat together in the garden, in our garden last summer and saw each other last time in person. We talked a lot about teaching writing, and Katharina and I have published a little book on that, writing in English studies, with our colleague Vivian Gremlio. Sophia is holding it into camera and we can see that she has it there. It's super
It's
cool.
a great book. I mean, it's a fantastic book.
Yeah. And what we were super excited about and inspired by were what you told us about how you were getting to know the writing instruction at Bellingham, and we had so many questions. It was bound to be an interesting thing. And I would like to start with a quote from one of your syllabi that you sent us, where you write in the introductory part, basically, you write, "Writing is part and parcel of nearly every human endeavor, and many endeavors owe their existence and essence to writing. Writing is one of the primary ways we navigate life's complexities. It's often how we capture our wild worlds. In English 101, you will explore how writing shows up in different contexts and for different audiences." And I had to laugh out loud when I read that. It's totally a class that I would like to take again. I think that's super enthusiastic and nice. And could you tell us a bit more about how you frame writing? What writing is for you in the context of the class?
Yeah, that's a really cool question. So, writing in the context of this class to me is a form of expressing myself or a form for students to express themselves and their ideas. It's not just a communication tool. It's not like they, do all their thinking, think, and then they have their ideas and they put it into writing. It's more so that writing itself is a meaning making activity, which is also something that I write in the syllabus. So, to me, then writing means communicating ideas, but also developing ideas, and basically using writing as a space um, to develop those ideas and communicate them to other audiences.
And like immediately when you frame the kinds of projects you want students to do in the class, the first thing, the first project is a podcast. How does that work? How is a podcast writing? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that because some of my more I want to say critical students always ask, how is a podcast writing? Like we are just talking. Um, and first of all, I love that reaction because it shows that they can learn in the class that there are different forms of writing or that there are products that they listen to, like a podcast, and that writing is behind that product, something that maybe most of us wouldn't expect in the first place. So the kind of podcast that my students are making is not so much like this conversational podcast. It's more a storytelling and source-based podcast. So what that means is that they go out into the world and record interviews. They sometimes take like news clips or interview their professors to get insight on their topic, and then they write monologues in between those puzzle pieces that they've the sound bits that they've gathered. And why this is writing is because, first of all, they have a script, right? So they have to write a script first and then they record it and put all their little pieces in there. And the cool thing about this is because the writing that they know from college, the writing they know from high school, and particularly from classes that are called English, that have English in their name, is something like the 5-paragraph essay. It's something like, I am going to argue that, already have the idea finished. We know what we're going to say. We're going to spend all that essay proving why we're right about our thesis statement, right? The podcast is more explorative. They start with a question. They want to answer that question. Then they go out, ask different people what they think about their topic. And why that is writing is because writing to me is also a conversation with others, and they are gathering other people's contributions to a larger conversation, and they themselves are then putting that together to tell a story that way. And if I can be a little nerdy right now, the word composition means putting together, right? So they put together different bits of things that other people have said, that people have thought, and they learn to use sources in a way that might be a little more unpredictable, to put all of these together to compose their podcast.
Do they choose their own topics?
Yes, they do. So we have a container for the class, which is just like a theme, basically just out of fairness, because otherwise students are often choosing very abstract topics that will be hard to write about. But we spend a good 4 or 5 sessions at the beginning of the quarter for them to narrow down their topic. So during my first year of my master's program, the container for the class was college life, which can be pretty broad and can like encompass things such as like imposter syndrome or like roommate issues, but it
Yeah.
can also talk about like homesickness or losing your high school sweetheart and stuff like that, like a wide range of topics. And for this year's curriculum, the container is place, so also very, very open and very there are very many options this notion of place can be interpreted. You could like look at a classroom as a place. You could also look at nostalgia as a place.
Mhm.
So we have this invention period at the beginning of the class where they come up with their own place or their own topic that they then want to write about for their 2 projects. Sometimes we also have 3 projects. So they write about their own topic and choose it at the beginning. Yeah.
I was super excited when I saw this, like a podcast, and the way you frame the research process on this, the topic finding process seems like a really cool, low threshold entry point to writing, to coming up with an interesting story, as you said, right? Not just an academic argument, not just other papers as sources, as the conversation to join, you said, but also like having an immediate real life context for what you want to do, and then putting that into words and putting that into notes. I think also the production of a podcast requires you to take a lot of to have a lot of preliminary thoughts on how you want to compose the final thing. It's different from a 5-paragraph essay in that you don't have this pre-configured structure. You don't have a pre-configured style and register. You don't have a pre-configured source of sources, basically the library or online repositories of academic papers. It's all much more open and lends itself to more creative thinking. I think that's a super cool way to introduce the concept of writing.
I also think it's super fascinating, and I'm already so very much inspired to test this out myself. That I think it practices something that is so essential to creative writing, obviously, but academic writing as well, and that is to narrativize one's ideas in sort of the type of scholarship that we do. Being able to compose a compelling research narrative is essential in helping others understand where we are coming from and where we are going with the arguments that we're trying to make. And I know that a lot of students in the beginning struggle very much with this idea of composing, creating a text that has narratives that readers can follow, because these very technical instructions of 5-paragraph essays and argumentations and thesis statements are logical in and of themselves, but this is not all there is to writing a compelling, well-argued academic essay or article or book even. So I find this very, very interesting that it's the task as you phrase it is very playful and still puts a very low or contains a very low threshold when it comes to sort of trying to sort of make this work in student context or in learning context, but at the same time it practices something that is so essential.
Yes, I want to add on to that real quick. The reason why the podcast is the first project is precisely so they can take this, what you mentioned, like called playful element, this kind of storytelling notion, this trying out sources that are not just from the library, but maybe, your mom or like your roommate, or someone who works in a coffee shop, like depending on your topic. But doing that as their first project completely breaks open these harsh boundaries of what an academic paper is supposed to look like. So the second project is one that is more formal, that has a more formalized structure, and that exists in that way in a lot of social sciences. It's a sort of research paper. But because they do the podcast, they now in their research paper also value sources that might not be considered, proper sources, which, I have a lot of issues with that idea. And they start to break some of these boundaries by thinking about, how could I include storytelling in this research proposal, in this research paper? How could I maybe use visual elements? How could I quote the interviews that I've already collected for my podcast in this research paper? And because they start with such a broad and like more open project, they then make the next project, which seems more narrow, they break that open, which is so beautiful to witness.
Yeah, I was wondering, because the approach first, especially if you come from a background like, I mean, we've received our training in the teaching of writing more in this writing in the disciplines approach, which ties the learning of writing very closely to the disciplinary practices and ways of thinking and doing research and so on. So I was wondering, okay, so this is what your students like do in this one-on-one class. Is it's not really about academic writing yet, and it's also not really a subject that is closely tied to their discipline. Still, the way you talk about it just sounds like really it excites me, but at the same time I'm wondering, so what is your idea or your impression or your experience with how does this translate what they do in this class? How does it translate to their studies in their major or their general university experience? Because I can also, of course, I mean, I can come up with my own ideas or my own answers to my own question. Just thinking like, okay, once you've experienced that writing is about communication first and only about like formal stuff and all these nitty gritty academic things like quoting and paragraph writing and style and all this, like only second. This is already probably a very, very valuable experience. It also sounds as if it really ties into community building.
Yeah, so first of all, maybe I should say a little bit about the sort of students that are in English 101. So this English 101 class is a required writing class that every student at Western Washington University has to take. There are some exceptions, but the majority of students, no matter their major, are going through this class. And it's usually a class that students take during their first year at Western Washington University. So a lot of them don't even know what their major is yet, which is due to the structure of American universities, that you just pick your major later on during your studies and you do a little bit of general studies in all sorts of fields in your first year. So I either have students who are undecided or who are from completely different fields. Some of them might be interested in graphic design, others might want to do like a biology, so it's all over the place. And this class is also called Writing Your Way Through Western, basically through our institution. So we clearly cannot do like, okay, we do week 1 is how to write in the humanities, week 2 is how to write in social sciences, week 3 is how to write in biology. Like, that's nuts. Like, I also cannot teach that because I have not written in any other disciplines besides the humanities. So what we try to do is to teach students to gain an awareness for audiences and writing contexts. So one of the key concepts of the class is writing looks and works differently in different places. It is impossible to teach writing, basically, because all the conventions are different. From writing an email to your professor to writing a lab report in your chemistry lab, like those are the both are writing, but they are both so different. So instead of trying to teach all of them, we teach our students skills to understand a rhetorical situation. Who are we talking to? Who's our audience? What kind of style do I need to use here? And so on. So that maybe just as a background to your answer, to your question, Katharina, that we're not necessarily trying to teach all these disciplinary rules, and more so kind of give them tools to decode different situations, whether they are in the classroom or outside the classroom. And then I wanted to just say something about language and style in general. So this is where we get a lot of resistance from our students. They come to this writing class. A lot of them, are there like, oh yeah, I always had A's in English. I'm going to be so good at this class. But they got A's for writing 5-paragraph essays, which is like a national structure of writing essays in the United States. It's an introduction, 3 supporting paragraphs, and 1 conclusion. And it is boring as fuck. Like, it does not produce interesting writing, because it just is about proving an idea and ignoring all the research that might disprove their idea. It's also very black and white. It's often like pro or con essays and so on. They are brilliant at that. In fact, they're being tested in that in high school and praised for doing well in that. Then they come to English 101 and it's like, and then they have this teacher like standing in front of them telling them, I actually don't care about your grammar as long as I can understand. Like, I don't care if you like have typos in your writing. I don't care if you use the subjunctive or some like shit. Sorry, I should stop swearing. Like, if you use these, I get very passionate about this, because this is something I had to learn, because I was this person in undergrad who was like, oh, I know all the grammar. I am such a good English speaker, and I know all of that, and I know how to use they and their, like the difference between those 3. But it really doesn't matter, because your ideas are not tied to grammar, and like focusing on this notion of standard grammar and this like one and only style to use is actually very exclusionary to different types of Englishes and squashes ideas. It doesn't, focusing so much on language and style. And, my students come in saying, oh, I'm not allowed to use I in my papers, or all these things. Like, ideas just get crushed and they just focus on language, which is what they then do in English 101, because they're so lost. Like, how am I going to do a podcast is what they think at the beginning. And then they start coming back with all these like language corrections, because that's the only thing they can hold on to. So you said low threshold at the beginning, but it's actually a really painful road for them to like grapple with this idea of making a podcast where the teacher hippy dippy says, I don't care about your grammar, right?
I want to declare this a swear word inclusive podcast, also for my own benefit. I would like to just briefly comment on what you just said, because I find this very important. We've noticed this in other podcasts and on the blog as well a few times, I think, that students, and I include myself there, tend in the very beginning to cling to very formalized rules and things that for the development of academic ideas aren't necessarily super crucial. So you talked about grammar. Like my shtick was always to look for formatting guidelines and to rigorously stick to that. And sort of I made this out to be like one of the primary issues of my writing, and that oftentimes, while this provided me with some security, and I think it gives our students a lot of security, it does exactly what you said. It distracts from the actual purpose of academic writing or creative writing, which is to explore ideas, express ideas, communicate ideas, and join a conversation over ideas. And I find this so interesting that wherever we go and whatever topic we sort of address in this sort of unconditional teaching sphere, we keep coming back to this notion that rules are fine and dandy, but there are quite a huge number of issues with that as well.
I'd like to come back to a thing that Sophia said before. I think your phrasing was it breaks wide open the research that they do in the more formalized training. And to me, the words you use, breaking wide open, were inspiring as such, basically, because I thought this is breaking wide open a lot of the things that we teach in formalized writing education, basically, not just the focus on communicating ideas, so writing in a more broader sense, exploratory pursuit of interests and questions within a container topic, but also the idea of research. I think that's what I find especially valuable also, that this is not tied to library research or internet research with regard to academic papers, but more broadly explorative of sources that can then be that can be found in your immediate real world context. I don't want to overemphasize this distinction between real world and academic world, because I do think both are real. But you get the point, right? That this is valuable for people who might not stay in an academic context for work, which is most of the students. So having this broader notion of not only writing as a means of communication, but also doing research as a form of gathering sources, gathering inspiration in various ways, various media, from various people, and thinking of these as research to be worked into creative writing works in inverted commas, I think is super valuable to learn in such a class. And of course, in my head, I had students who hadn't done much writing before, but of course, you're right. When you've had intensive training in 5-paragraph essay structure, but nothing else much, then this is, of course, a break with tradition and what you know.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I look, or this program looks for sources outside the library, that's just what I'm going to call it, is that distinction that you keep pointing out between real world and academic world. And yes, of course, both are real, even though it doesn't always feel like that. But the reason there is a reason why that is a distinction, that we say academic and real world, which also kind of implies that academic is like practice, or maybe just like a little bit of playing around, see who's the smartest and who can use the most sources or something like that. And then real world's like, okay, what is actually real? Like, what are we actually doing? And this distinction is, to me, problematic because it excludes voices that are not part of academe, and it repeats voices that have been part of academe forever, basically. So of course we have to first tell our students, like, I start the session when we talk about research, what is a source? No, actually that's not true. I ask them, what is research? When was the last time you did research? And then these things come up. I was like, okay, what did you do when you found out that I was your instructor? Oh, I looked you up on Rate My Professor. Like, that is research. That is research. Or how many times have you checked the ratings on a restaurant that you're going to go to? That is research, right? That is not something that just happens in the Ivy Tower, like in academe, right? So to open up the kinds of sources, what counts as knowledge, is essentially not to like only say, okay, here's also another world outside academe, but how can we combine these worlds? How can we break with that strict boundary between what counts as knowledge? And to acknowledge that is an indigenous practice that here in the US, for us, of course, plays a different role than it does in Germany. But this notion that, elders or community members are knowledge makers and knowledge holders is an indigenous practice. So by, trying to emulate these practices into research, we hope to open up what counts as research, what counts as knowledge a little more, and to also make students not understand, that sounds too harsh, but to have students encounter sources not just for them to prove their own point, but to extend and further their own point. I mean, probably I'm going to assume a lot of, like, when we've done research, like, we have this great idea, especially as students, and then I think, okay, now I just need to find a smart person who has more like academic credit than me, who says the exact same thing, so my idea is valid. Bullshit, right? So that's not what we are trying to find sources for. But again, this notion of conversation, like, how can this source speak to me, and how can I develop my own point based on this source, not to just like say the same thing to make my point valid in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I assume that this ties in also with what you said about standard grammar, and that's not what you care about in the language your students use to express themselves in these, maybe later in the more formal papers, but not in this first podcast project, basically, because if you correct for standard grammar, you exclude a lot of languages that don't conform with, let's say it, white, mostly male, Eurocentric, let's say Aristotelian hierarchies of argumentation.
Yes, so it's not just the, now you also mentioned this argumentation structure. So it's the form, as in like just the container of a paper that constrains, which is, what I've been kind of shit talking the 5-paragraph essay or like thesis statements in itself as well. And then also the language itself. So here in the US, and I would say the same would be the case for Germany and also for German students studying English, just as we talk in dialects and accents, we also write in dialects and accents. It is exclusionary to request students to code switch when they start writing, to pretend that they're suddenly this white male Western figure of producing knowledge, which is not the case for a lot of people in academia. So the reason why, even in the second project, I don't really care about grammar and typos is because, first of all, like, to me, it's about understanding their ideas. And most of the times, nobody has like that kind of grammar where I just don't understand, like there's no verb in the sentence. That doesn't happen. But for example, like in African American vernacular English, a lot of times the third person singular S is dropped. So I still understand a sentence if there's no third person singular S. I still understand what they're saying. So to say, oh, we need a standard so we can all understand each other is a racist argument, in my opinion. So that is why like trying to de-emphasize grammar and proper instruction and what tends to use, like, we just kind of try to back off from that for these reasons.
I think we're all dancing in our chairs, basically just listening to you. This is super cool.
I'm finding this so valuable because in my understanding, especially of writing classes and composition classes, the emphasis of correct language or language correctness is just so, I don't know, so entrenched. And but I think it's, and I'm excited, and I was also already excited when we talked about this in summer, because it just sounds as if the way, at least in your university, in the program that you work in, does this is so far away already from these outdated ideas, and that you actively engage with notions of, I don't know, how can we make these writing classes anti-racist and anti-exclusionary? How can we take into account that this is about communication and not about the language correctness determined by like a very small minority of authoritative people who have come to define that. But it's also, I feel like it's so hard to get away from these ideas, because one of the reasons I think that so many instructors cling to language correctness is because it's so easy to correct, right? To correct papers and to grade papers based on language correctness. It's the easiest thing in the world if if you are good at this, to read the paper and like almost automatically, right, get out your red pen and just mark the comma errors, just mark the grammar mistakes that are in the paper, and already you have done a substantial part of your grading, which is bullshit. But this is what as instructors do, especially if they are overworked and if they don't really have the capacity and the time and the, I don't know, the support to step back and do, for instance, right, what we've come to know as hands behind your back reading and like engaging with papers. And this is one of those practices that we've come to know and also to recommend to other instructors, because it's so useful, because it gets you out of this mode of I'm just correcting the one thing that is most easy to do, and that is just marking grammar errors.
Or missing periods in MLA citation.
Yeah.
Yes. So much in what you just said, Katharina, that you have me thinking about. So first, I do want to note that there is, even within the English department, backlash against this kind of de-emphasizing of standard English. A lot of professors will not say it that way because they are smart and understand that that's them outing themselves as racists, but they will still work that into their papers. When we get to upper division classes where it comes to writing an argumentative paper, we're right back to square one then. And so is probably the case in other disciplines. And I have interacted with other teachers that teach writing on higher levels that are very resistant to things that we do in English 101, right? Our English 101 director gets emails like this all the time. My students they don't know how to write paragraphs. They don't know how to cite their sources. They don't know how to do this. And it's like, well, they haven't learned how to do it in your field yet. So you need to give them instruction. I know they think English 101, or other instructors think English 101 is this like solution for every student. They will all be perfect writers. But as you know, I've said, there is no perfect writing, because writing is always different depending on the context. And what you also mentioned, Katharina, about grading is that I find grammar and like your works cited, the citation practices that you use, those are the easiest to quantify, because it is so hard to really grade an idea. Like, how are you going to dare to really put a number, or here in the US, it's a letter, to an idea? That is so hard because people respond to ideas differently depending on their positionality, their research interests, their past experiences. And to try to combat that, which is not always successful, because grading and evaluation is deeply ingrained in Western institutions of education, we have this idea of a labor contract in English 101. So as I already said, it's really hard to grade writing, and all of you have had to grade writing in your careers. Yes, a lot of papers and a lot of student ideas and so on. And even though like the parameters for the papers that all of you are grading, BA theses, MIA theses, or just term papers, the parameters are often very similar, but the work that you get is probably super different, not just in quality, but just in the way that students write and develop their ideas. Cool, because different people do different things. The same is the case in English 101. We have podcasts, we have a research proposal or a research paper, but how students end up doing these podcasts, what they end up looking like, is often very different. So already this notion of a standard within a class is kind of faulty. Same as it is for like standard as in the sense of language, it is for the sense of like work that is happening. It just doesn't hold. But more importantly, it is very hard to judge someone's quality of writing. So what we do with the labor contract is that as the name already says, we focus on the labor that students do. And with that, I don't mean the effort or the time that they invest in a task, because brains work different for different people. So you can't really say, well, Jessica spent 2 hours on this, but, Katarina did all of that in 30 minutes. That just is, different. Like Jessica has cats, so I don't know, they might be distracting her.
That's absolutely correct, and a very realistic assessment of the situation. Continue.
Yeah, there we go. So, and often it's not even those like playful examples, it's neurodivergency and other reasons that play into this as well. So it's not about the time or effort, but essentially it is about the readiness of students to get to work in class. So my maybe to like just a little info on American classes, every single class gets a grade. It's not that you get a grade at the end of the module for your module exam. It's every single class you get a grade, and within that class you are graded on your projects. So they get a lot of grades. And what we do in English 101 is basically just graded on an incomplete and complete basis. So did you do the labor or did you not do the labor? And for smaller homework assignments, that's usually very straightforward. We ask them to read a text, to respond to it, have a word count, and so on, so we can either mark it as complete and incomplete. For the larger projects, such as the podcast, it's a little more complex. We have a rubric, so that's very similar to grading and evaluation practices. But what we look for when we actually evaluate students' work is not like, for example, one of the criteria would be an introduction that introduces the research question. When I then read the introduction of my students, I don't look at how sophisticated they chose their words, or how beautiful they described a situation, or how well they transported me back to my own childhood or something like that. I just look, do you have an introduction? Do you have a research question? Check. Mm-hmm. It's basically looking for the what and less for the how. And that takes so much weight off of students' shoulders, because they're suddenly not worried so much about like writing the way that the teacher wants you to write, mm-hmm. or interpreting a text like you think the teacher wants you to interpret the text. They start actually taking risks and exploring new ways of writing because the pressure is off for them, because they know, I just have to write an introduction. It doesn't matter whether I use the perfect technique or whether I use the perfect anecdote to start my paper. So that takes hopefully a lot of pressure away from students, and in the end also, makes it for me as the grader that I'm not evaluating their students' work, but I'm engaging with their ideas. Which is also why for their larger projects, they actually fill out the rubric themselves. They tell me, hey, Sophia, I wrote an introduction, it's here, and here's my research question, and the reason I did this way was because I wanted to achieve that. And that's not just making students do the grading for me, but it's actually, in my opinion, more ethical, because I can see what they really wanted to do. I don't have to guess. Like, I'm not, it's really weird to start with a quote from, I don't know, a Harry Potter movie. Like, why would they do that? And then my student explains me, oh yeah, this is because later on I'm referencing this thing and I already want to, get the reader hooked into like the Harry Potter universe. So, and then I'm like, yeah, that's awesome. That makes so much sense. Something I could not have known if I had just had the text. So grading here, again, really is a conversation, but not one where students have to fight for their grade and justify why they deserve an A. It's they just explain why they did the thing they did, which sneakily already also teaches them to reflect on their own writing.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, so much of that chimes with the conversations we had, the three of us, but also with the Lily Goes Mental team last year, when we talked a lot about mental health and grading practices and how detrimental standard grading or traditional grading practices and university examination practices are to students' mental health, because they put them under pressure, so much under performance pressure, and alienate them from their ideas, from their creativity, from taking risks, as you said, right? One of the things that Katarina always says is to learn at all requires taking risks. Otherwise, it's an expert practice and not learning at all. So this to facilitate that in the ways you frame writing in the ways you grade the processes of writing if you can't get away from grades, as you can't in your system, as we can't in our system, right? But finding these solutions is really inspiring. I mean, we all have our individual rubrics. We've talked about how our grading criteria for such a long time, but I remember the moment when we sat in together last year in summer, and you introduced this idea of this. You call it a labor contract now, and I like that. In some sense, I think we talked about grading contracts, and that's the term that Peter Elbow introduces, I think, where you don't evaluate against criteria of quality, but you protocol stages in the process, and once they are checked, they count toward the grade in simply by completion, basically, but not by quality or anything else. And I think that's super useful ideas, and they've been around for a long time, right? And in Germany, it's still something that we have to wrap our heads around. It's quite disappointing sometimes how backward our notion of writing instructions are.
Yeah, I mean, there are still a lot of problems with these ungrading practices, and I'm using this in the wider sense that is being used in terms of not getting rid of any grades, but trying to decenter grades in some way, basically. But I think what's really important about the way you are doing it is any ungrading practice, or any practice, I think, that allows students to develop their own relationship to the thing they are doing and to the strategies that help them do that, to their own learning and to the topic at hand, is good, because grades discourage you from that, or they outright prevent that, right? Because what they do is they center the thing, the evaluation that is going on in the mind of the teacher, basically. So what they facilitate is a focus on what goes on in the mind of another person, and not what goes on in your own mind, basically, and in your relationship to the thing you are engaging in and that you are learning. So I think any practice that decenters this evaluation relationship, basically, and like more foregrounds or centers your relationship with what you are actually doing, is good. And the way you describe this, especially, I really like what you said about grading is a conversation. So I really like this practice of engaging with students, having conversations about, okay, what did you want to achieve here? Because this is really the question that asks them to have a conversation about what is your actual relationship to the thing that I'm seeing here, to the product. Therefore, I think this is a really interesting ungrading practice, even though you are still giving them grades. But in terms of just not thinking about this in terms of black and white, either we have grades or we don't, because sometimes we still need to have them, but we can find ways to decenter them, and then this becomes a practice of ungrading. So yeah, this is really, I really like it. And hearing your talk about the effect this has is really cool.
So there's critiques from different sides about ungrading practices. One really cool, just super short article I read by Sherry Craig that says, "Your grading contract ain't it." I don't know if you've heard about it. It's a very niche, like it's not niche, but from like the composition scholarship in the US. And she said that a lot of English departments, in response to the Black Lives Matter protests in June 2020, put these statements on their websites talking about how their writing practices can become anti-racist, and that just including a grading contract or a labor contract would fix these racist implications of grading, which, in and of itself is great. But what she says in her contract is that, or in her essay, in her piece, is that that's not all that you can do, that even those grading practices, that these alternative grading practices can still and do still entail white supremacy and can practice that. Like, who succeeds in these labor contracts, who really gets to, the amount of trust that students have to place in their teachers, like in their one-on-one teachers, is a lot. So think about students who come out of high school who are so used to, doing all their work so they get a good grade, and then they have this teachers like, I'm not going to judge the quality. That is also a sense of insecurity, and they have to place a lot of trust in the teacher that they're not going to come bite them in the back, which, to be honest, a lot of Black students experience in education because of the lack of Black teachers. So it's hard. It's a big ask for Black people and people of color to just trust me right away and say, you're going to be fine. You just need to do the work. So there's also nuance to that, right? And something that both Sherry Craig and also other people bring up, though for different reasons, is that when they leave English 101, they go to a different class and they have the standard grading again. So what does that do? Like, are we doing them a disservice by being very loose with that? Or is English 101 just like this little piece of haven where they then, they have to go back and do something completely different again? I think I want to resist that and say, like, English 101 enables them to think, to break something wide open, but also that doesn't mean that the center goes away, right? They still practiced in other grading and more standard grading practices. Yeah, I just wanted to list those voices as well.
I find what you're talking about both to be extraordinarily inspiring and terribly frustrating, because all the things that we've discussed so far really resonate a lot with me. Responding to student papers is one of the most essential thing that I can do in the humanities. I don't dare to make any judgment calls about this when it comes to sort of disciplines outside of the humanities. But I like me and my colleagues, we perceive sort of this responding to student papers and giving good feedback to be such a central, integral part to our discipline. But the structures in which we do this make this so hard. I certainly find this very, very hard for a variety of different reasons. First and foremost, because the way in which I need to respond to student papers by grading, for instance, puts a strain on the relationship, this learning relationship that I have with my students, that is very, very important for them and for me in order for us to make progress together. And my primary example for that is always this one student who gave this brilliant response to my feedback to them. I sent them back their paper, and I had written a longish response to that paper, as I want to do, sort of trying to sort of show them what I understood from their paper and what I really liked about it, what I appreciated it, where I think are sort of what I think that could be improved upon, and so on and so forth. And then I end without further comment. At one point I end with a grade, but it always includes an invitation to come and talk and have a conversation about it again, and that I'd be happy to sort of talk about it. And the student responded quite brilliantly with, I understand all of the points that you raised in your feedback and in your response, and I agree to all of these points. I still think I deserve a better grade. And I found this absolutely brilliant. And at the same time, it just broke my heart. And I had a real crisis after that, because it alienated them so much from my response to their paper. Up until the moment that the students saw the grade, we were like, communication was good. And then the grade hit, and it just precluded any further sort of conversation, because I didn't know at that moment, and I still don't know, how to react in a sensible way towards that, because my knee-jerk reaction is, yes, grading sucks. I'm sorry that this is how this is going. But this isn't helpful, neither to me nor to the students. It may help to say this in class or in conversation before you grade, in order to show, look, I'm dissatisfied with this process as much as you are. But grades are grades, and they suck, and they're not helpful. So, and I find this frustrating, and maybe that brings me to a question that I have for you. Because I feel like at the moment, attempts to improve conversations and the learning experience for both students and instructors and teachers is put on the shoulders of individual teachers, with a big but that you can't step outside the boundaries of what has been prescribed in sort of study programs and so on and so forth, unless there is some sort of systemic consensus. And that sort of brings me to asking you how that works in your department, because you already said that your boss gets these emails and basically has to elaborate on your grading practices and so on and so forth. So I would like to know, how does that work for you? How many people are involved in this process of defending an alternative teaching and learning practice that sounds actually quite cool?
Yes. Oh, I have so much to say to all of what you just said, but I'm going to respond to that question first. So the way this English 101 is not just a single class that happened to be taught by like 25 different people. It is a program. So we have a program director, Jeremy Cushman, who has basically devised with other scholars and his students as well this sort of labor contract. And he also writes the curriculum for each year, and then we get like an annotated schedule and we go and teach what is in there, obviously putting our own spin on it, and because we all have different teaching styles and preferences and so on. So that is like just a little programmatic note. And Jeremy also has an assistant who is also involved in curriculum development and talking to teaching assistants and so on. So the sort of resistance that we get happens in, I would say, 3 different ways. So there's either students in our classrooms who very struggle with this idea of a labor contract. It's actually heartbreaking to see, because it's often students who have very much excelled in the grading system, who've always found their way found their way through to getting brilliant grades, and who are very dependent on getting really good feedback from their teachers. Yes, we are all pointing till Jessica and I were pointing at each other. So that's definitely something that I had to unlearn for myself. And these students then come to me and tell me about all the writing projects that they've done and all the cool things that they've done, and that they don't know if they really need to do a podcast because they've already done so much writing. So that is, to me, the most heartbreaking point, because they come to me and what they are saying is, Sophia, I need you to know that I'm smart. Mm-hmm. And they are not even saying that in a condescending manner. It's a matter of survival for them, because grades, and you've talked a lot about this on this podcast and in your blog and in all your projects, how detrimental they are to learning. So we don't really have to go there, but that is the resistance that I get. And what helps with that is relationship building. Really telling my students, hey, you can't really lose anything in this class because you start with nothing. And then we're going to work together. I'm here in office hours if you need to talk about things. We do a lot of writing in class, and I know this is going to feel scary, but at the end, these students are the ones that are most proud of their podcast, because podcasting, as you know, is not just talking to other people, but it's also editing and finding music and sound effects and cutting everything together. And that's a whole nother thing that they have to do, that their skills of writing 5-paragraph essays is not going to help them at all. No. So, but when they come through that, that's a big learning moment for themselves, and they're like on cloud 9. Everyone's so proud, and it's really beautiful to see. So that resistance is sort of bridged with relationship building and with, like, as I said earlier, asking for that trust, which is a hard thing to do. The second type of resistance comes from like the most random people, sometimes roommates of English 101 students, sometimes parents that email us teachers about, I heard that we actually got one of those emails last year. I was shocked to find out that grammar is no longer being evaluated in English 101. How are students going to survive in the world? And it was literally an email like that. And then if we get emails like that, we forward them directly to Jeremy. Sometimes they already directly land with him because these people do a little bit of research and know who's responsible. And then basically Jeremy gives them a response of a little like more concise of what I said earlier, how grammar is racist and how it's an exclusionary practice and so on and so on. So that's the other type of resistance we get. And the third type of resistance is from people either in the English department or just other teachers around campus. And that is probably the hardest one to address because these people are also like could be the teachers of a former 101 students, and so they think like these 101 students somehow are damaged or don't know like how university works because of English 101. And because of that sort of institutional standing of other professors, that resistance is a little harder. But again, bless Jeremy, he takes on all of that because, we are as TAs also very much underpaid, and, it's not our job to defend a program that he created, that he developed. So that all goes to him. So I don't always know how that goes, but institutionally, it is the 101 program, the writing program director can direct it in the way that the director wants it to direct, which can also be super problematic. We've just happened to get really lucky with Jeremy to have these alternative grading practices, so they stay out of that basically. But he did try sending paragraphs instead of grades for a couple of semesters, and they don't like that. So he would just write paragraphs about the students instead of grades. He tried that, that was his form of resistance, but they're like, no, we need to put a letter into the system. Mm-hmm. So it only goes so far. I don't know if that really answered your question, Jessica. I just talked forever.
No, that was brilliant. As somebody who talks forever as well, never mind. I'm really interested to hear what your students say. You talked a bit about how they react initially to being sort of put into a class like this, and I'm still mind blown by this idea that all of them have to take this class. But what are the responses to what you've been doing, or what are the responses to the projects after they concluded the class? That's what I'm really interested in. What do they tell you and your colleagues about this experience?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag for sure. Some people at the end have commented, some students have commented that there was lack of clarity in the labor contract, which I totally understand that as a criticism, like lack of transparency maybe is a different word, that because I don't think in percentages and how many points a student has earned, when they come talk to me and they've missed too many classes, then in office hours, I sit with them and help them work through the stuff that they've missed, and then I waive that absence. So there's a little bit of we call them black market deals that sometimes happen when the labor contract doesn't really hold anymore. And so I understand that lack of clarity or transparency is a point of criticism for students who really crave, not everyone, but a lot of students crave that structure, that what do I have to do to get an A or to pass this class? Which is something that, they have learned somewhere to think that way. But most of the responses are they are very proud of themselves. They thought, oh, I never thought that I could do a podcast. I've never tried these things before. Like in this class, I tried out so many new things that I never considered before. And the best comments are either I hated writing and now I think writing is okay, or I thought I was really bad at writing, or every teacher has always told me that I'm never going to be a good writer. And this class has shown me that it's not about being a good writer. It's just about writing. It's not about being a brilliant writer. It's just, you just write. It's a practice, right? You write or you don't write. It's not good or bad. It's just like you write. And so I tie those responses back to the sort of grading system, or the lack of letter grades in this class, as much as we can. So they do show like a development in that, some of them are skeptical at the beginning, others are confused. This is another thing. In the US, you can always see your grade, like the current grade you're on in the class. It's already automatically being calculated by our online learning platform. But I have, like in English 101, we disable that function, so they can't see that. And that's also something that sometimes they're confused with. The reasoning behind that, of course, is that we don't want them to like start thinking strategically about how much they still have to do to get an A, or like that, they can like lose focus because, oh, I'm on an A, like I can step back a little bit. They should step back if they're overwhelmed, but they shouldn't base that off of their grades, So that's another thing that sometimes, confuses them. That's not always present, even though there is a reasoning behind that. So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I thought this, what you describe as confusion or anxiety, right, is something that we witness often and talk about often too, right? That the grading and evaluation systems of institutional education are so fear-inducing, and many students have internalized this fear and anxiety from hour one, basically, from the beginning of their institution and school, that they have developed strategies of control by either finding out as much about formalities as they can, or by expertly reading the minds of their individual teachers. And both are, of course, not very helpful at university anymore, where rules are different from school, and where individual teachers have their individual rules and they are not very, very uniform. And then, especially if you try to do things differently, be it as benevolent as it may, it throws people off who have been trained to hold on for dear life to rules and knowledges about this specific teacher does things. And then if you try alternatives, it's not easy to adapt. I think that's one of the things that we face often, because we try to do things differently too, and we explain it again and again and again. And I had a situation like that in my class the other day, where toward the end of the semester I had to explain how my portfolios work again, because it was so much freer and less rule governed than anything else that student who asked me experienced in other classes, that she was anxious about getting it right. And when I said, well, you can't really get it wrong as long as you have completed A, B, and C, and that's it, right? She looked at me with this slight panic, as if there was something that she was missing, that I wasn't giving her and holding back.
Which is, but it is because education is about, the default is people get it wrong, and getting it right is hard. And we've been trained to think like this about learning and about ourselves so much that it's completely like, I don't know, it's kind of natural that these anxieties arise, and so tragic and so sad.
I mean, that's why, Sophia, in one of your syllabi, I've just read that again, and I've highlighted it when I read it. You wrote very beautifully, one of my jobs is to set things up in such a way that you can make projects of which you're proud. And this is such a teaching philosophy that is so counter to mainstream teaching, which is set up to challenge students to make mistakes and then grade them by their mistakes or against their mistakes, basically. And that's the norm that people use usually. And I was so heartwarmed to read that in your syllabus.
Also, credit to a lot of the language to Jeremy in that syllabus. That's not all my own, but I wanted to respond to what both of you said earlier about this anxiety that comes up. So in my syllabus, I talk a lot about risk taking, and we've talked about it in this podcast as
Mm.
well, that I encourage risk taking, and I hope by taking away this layer of constant evaluation and grading that they are more encouraged to take risks. Here's a question I get on day 2. Could you give us some examples of the risk that we could take? And it's so funny to hear that, but then I tell them, if you're taking a risk, you'll know it because it's going to feel like shit. If you open your research paper with a poem, you're going to feel wrong about it, right? That's a risk. These kinds of things, like if you compose a song for your podcast, that's a risk. See, and then I already start listing examples of risks, which I don't really want to do because that again gives them a drop-down menu of the stuff that they could do. The point of taking risks is that there is no guidelines, which is so much to ask of students, right? Because they are not encouraged or really ever taught to take risks. And then something else that I wanted to respond to what you said, Till, about how this student of yours was looking for guidance of how to do their final project, and how often you've had to explain that. I have had a similar experience in my very, very first quarter of teaching English 101, where students have asked me a lot of questions about the labor contract, and it was also I remember so vividly how much we talked about the labor contract because it was my first quarter of teaching. So I was already also didn't know how that's going to play out in the end. Like they would ask all these what ifs questions, like what if I miss more than 3 classes? Like what happens? And I was kind of like, well, I don't know because I've never taught this class to the end. All that's to say, I remember how much we talked about the labor contract. Now, I'm teaching a different class this quarter, English 201, and one of my former 101 students from that class is in my 201 class, and I'm using the exact same labor contract. Most of the language I've copied from my syllabus from fall quarter. And in her response to the syllabus, I read, oh, I'm really liking this idea of the labor contract. I don't even remember doing this in 101, right? So to kind of show that a year later, she didn't know that was even a thing because what she remembered, oh, that's the class where we did the podcast and where we had to do a lot of writing and stuff like that. She doesn't remember the grading policy. And she was a very attentive student. She was there all the time. She was very engaged. So it's not like she just forgot about the class, right? So that to me was just such a wonderful thing to notice, is that I in that first class, but still now I'm so keen on, like, I need them to understand how this works so they're not confused. And in the year later, they have forgotten about it even existing. What they remember is their projects. What they remember is how they were feeling in the class, maybe the people they met, how the class changed their outlook on writing, not the system of grading and how many absences they were allowed to have or not.
Success.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that ties into a lot of the things that that we've discussed in the past. Like we just recorded a podcast with Leonie Ackermann about the questions or the issues of student trust and student distrust, and why it's a lot to ask of students to simply by default trust into the in the idea that that their teachers know what's good for them, and that teachers will abide by the rules that they set themselves, because we know that this doesn't work that way most of the time. So that's already something that resonates a lot with me from this past conversation. I also would like to underpin this idea of risk taking that you all brought up again, because this comes up so frequently. I find when we allow students to test their own limits, as it were, their own capabilities, skills, ideas, strategies, and so on and so forth in less regulated environments, then we often find that the results are very, very creative and that they make enormous progress. And that in addition to that there's a lot of enjoyment that is generated through that once students get the hang of it, of the risk taking, and find sort of the the thrill exhilarating, if you know what I mean. And I would like to just give an example that isn't from the humanities, because I suck at math. Okay, so I enjoyed doing sort of all kinds of math homework when I was in primary school, but later on that just fizzled out.
When they added letters.
Exactly, like that's when I started sucking at math. But I had a fantastic math teacher, and she was very keen on making it very clear to me how I could still sort of succeed in this class without making me feel like shit for not being able to do math. And I remember no exams, they are all a blur. But what I remember is this one math project that we had where we were allowed to substitute an exam for a collaborative math portfolio. And I remember working with, I think, 2 other students who were of a similar skill set that I was when it came to math. And I remember that we worked really, really hard on making this portfolio work. And I remember that when I handed it in, I was extraordinarily proud of having made it. I remember that anxiety levels for me for maths exam were always high, because this was like not failure, because I always muddled through somehow, but not like with a feeling of I managed to reach my own standards because like I'm a good girl and I get good grades, except not in maths. But with this portfolio, I found this was an inspiring task, not necessarily because it made me so much better at maths, it didn't, but because it taught me that I can do maths in a way that works for me. And I don't need to be terribly afraid of maths. I am afraid of maths when it comes to me in the form of quickfire exams or something like that. Like I lose the ability to calculate anything. But the moment you allow me to sort of work through these projects in my own time, I suddenly find ways to get this done. It may just take a little longer, and it doesn't make me a math professor, but I don't aspire to be that anyway. So, and I think that this is something that if we can incorporate this more and more in our teaching, at least to some degree, then we can give students amazing experiences of self-efficacy that are so valuable. If our objective truly is to make informed, critical thinking people leave university and go out into the world doing amazing things. Like if that's truly our objective, then I think that's how we need to go. And the last point that I wanted to make is that from what I've learned from talking to Till, Katharina, and also talking to you now and listening to what you say, is that grading invites this idea that perfection can be achieved. And we know that the idea of perfectionism is toxic to any kind of learning, but also to personal development, to intellectual and emotional growth. And this just like these conversations that I keep having with you guys just remind me so much that is true. That is true, and it is a real drag on learning and teaching.
Yes, I loved that math example because what this just stresses, and this is something that I strive for as a teacher as well, and it's hard to let go of sometimes, that my job is to teach students. My job is not to teach curriculum. So by opening up different ways of participating in a math class, this teacher of yours taught you as a student. She gave you the option to, do maths differently, and it was successful in the sense that you were proud of it, that you found enjoyment in that. And that to me is what it means to teach students, like the actual people in your class, not an abstract body of, a abstract body, full stop. It's to teach the people who are in your class and not your planned curriculum. I am right now teaching a class for the first time where I have built the curriculum, and I am basically changing everything, which is, not great for my stress levels, but meeting the students in the class, seeing what they need, what they want to do, I have to let go of some of the ideas that I really was excited about, because I'm not there to teach a curriculum and just power through. I'm there to teach those students and to, recognize them as my learning colleagues and not as someone that I speak up from above and speak down on them, which leads to the second point that I wanted to make. You said, Jessica, that grades you said that grades give us this idea that there is perfection. And a term that in a lot of the work that I've read and encountered that is used for that is mastery, which is very highly and rightly so criticized, because there is, now I'm going to say very claim heavy, but I don't think that there is such thing as mastery. And people who strive for mastery, which to be fair is exactly what academe wants to do and is built for, they are fooling themselves, because a thing to think to master a discipline, a subject, is a colonial thought. It is a thought that suppresses voices. It's a thought that gatekeeps. Because if you want to master something, that means you're going to exclude certain voices and focus on those who have supposedly achieved mastery before. And mastery shows up in the classroom as well. By default, the person who stands in front of the classroom oftentimes has 1 degree more than the students in the room, or has X many more years of experience and so on, which automatically is like master and students, right? Already sets that mark. And that is not that's a relationship that I'm not just going to ignore. It's still there, but I can at least try to step down from it by trying to avoid mastery, which I slip into still. Which leads me to 2 other points, which is control and possession, right? So this idea of I want to control my students, like classroom management. Oh, my students are on their phones, or they are not doing this and they're not doing that. And I get how frustrating that is. I feel like that all the time, but you cannot control a person. Just because you're standing in front of the room doesn't mean you can control the way they are thinking, the way they are acting. You have no idea what they've been up to the night before, if they're taking care of a relative, and all these other, aspects that go into this notion that a teacher needs to control the classroom, which is how a lot of teaching is taught in Germany still, and in the US as well, is very faulty, because it just exacerbates that master-student divide. And then possession is just to say, I am the holder of knowledge as a teacher, and I am here to bring you the knowledge, right? Of course, teachers bring something to the table that is different from the students, but in turn, students also bring something to the table, which is why I think it is so cool that in English 101, students get to work on their own topics. Because in the end, they become experts. At the end of the class, they are experts in their topic. Not everyone in the class did their projects on roommates, or on homesickness, or on what it's like to be a first-generation Black student at a predominantly white institution. They are the expert in that, and that just shows that it's not just the person in front of who happens to be standing in front of the class is the holder of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mics have been dropped, I think.
Yeah, Sophia, thank you so much for being with us, for speaking to us. This has been incredible. There are so many things you said that chime with us in our approach, definitely, but that will also stay with us. And I really admire the way you speak succinctly about these complex things and put this into very, very clear words. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me, for having this conversation. It was really inspiring also for me, and also just really cool to reconnect with people that were my teachers in undergrad, and to have a conversation about this, and people who've been very influential in the teacher that I am now today. So that's really feels like a full circle moment for me right now.
Oh,
for all of us, I think. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. Unconditional Teaching is a project by Katharina Pietsch, Tilsi Bura, and myself, Jessica Koch. Music by Lily Olason. If you want to know more about our project, head over to unconditional-teaching.com. Do you like our content and would like to engage with us? Check out our comment sections or contact us via team@unconditional-teaching.com.